Hi there. I'm here to tell you a little bit about what President Lincoln and his administration did in the face of the challenges that you read about in the reading packet today. You read about two big challenges. The challenge related to, excuse me, the political dissent and threats to national security that existed in the Union, including and especially in the border states. And you also read about the challenges related to slavery. Let's talk about both of them, but one at a time. So, first, how did President Lincoln address the challenges that took place that had to do with threats to the administration, threats to the national security presented by people who disagreed with him and people who sympathized with the Confederacy, who were citizens of the United States and were still living in the Union? Well, Lincoln, in April of 1862, decided that it was necessary for him to suspend the right of habeas corpus in Maryland. He signed an order that said the federal authorities or any authority had the right to arrest anybody in Maryland that they considered to be a threat to security and to detain those people indefinitely for as long as they needed to, without a trial, without a jury, without a lawyer, or any of the other due process rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution. The According to Lincoln, and it is true that the Constitution does say that the right of habeas corpus can be denied in times of emergency. And he said what that this obviously was a time of emergency, and therefore he does have the right to suspend habeas corpus. The Supreme Court, which was run primarily by Southern sympathizers, like Chief Justice Roger Taney, they heard a case called Ex parte Merryman. And in that case, they considered Lincoln's rationale for suspending the right of habeas corpus in Maryland and said that he couldn't do it. That yes, the Constitution says that you can suspend the right of habeas corpus when there was an emergency or a crisis of some kind, but the president can't do it himself unilaterally. Congress has to do it, and by law. Congress has to pass a bill that the president signs, and through the legislative process, then you can suspend habeas corpus, but only through the legislative process. Well, Lincoln heard the ruling and decided to ignore it and continued to suspend habeas corpus all throughout most of the border states, moving from Maryland to many of the other border states in after 1862. In March of 1863, Congress passes the Habeas Corpus Act, and President Lincoln signs it. And this authorizes officially the president to suspend habeas corpus. So it addresses Roger Taney's objection to Lincoln's order by giving his order the seal of approval from Congress. So between 1861 and 1865, about 14,000 people were arrested without the right of habeas corpus. These are people who were American citizens, residents of the Union, border states or unions, and including in the border states, who were arrested without trial, without an attorney, and held indefinitely, often for months, sometimes for years. This included Democratic Party newspaper publishers and journalists who criticized Lincoln and the war effort. And it was the subject of a lot of heated debate. Lincoln said, sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And I'm trying to save the Union here. So if it means I have to push a little bit up against the Constitution by suspending habeas corpus, then so be it. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, he said, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? Others disagreed with Lincoln and said that Lincoln had been a hypocrite, that in pretending to be the savior of the Union, he was actually burning the Union, burning the Constitution, burning habeas corpus, burning the free press, all of this, and therefore Lincoln was becoming like a dictator, and not the limited the presidency of that's limited in scope and power by the Constitution. Habeas corpus, or the detention of people, has been an issue throughout American history, including in the Civil War, but also in World War II, when 120,000 persons of Japanese descent were put in prison camps because they were suspected of being possible saboteurs or spies, without a trial, without a jury, without any of their due process rights being respected. After the War on Terror was declared by Congress, after the terrorist attacks on 9/11, a number of people were captured during that war and placed in a prison camp in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, without a court, without a trial, without a jury, and some thought that perhaps this was a violation of our civil liberties. So, what about slavery? You saw that there were a number of reasons why Lincoln was concerned about slavery, and now the question is, what really happened? Well, over the course of the first couple of years of the war, Lincoln finally came to believe that as commander in chief of the military, his wartime powers permitted him to emancipate slaves in those states that were still rebelling. So in September of 1862, Lincoln gave the Confederacy 100 days to surrender, or else he would declare that slavery was over in those parts of the Confederacy that were still in rebellion. That, of course, the Confederacy did not surrender. So on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is often misunderstood. Most people believe that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery, and the fact is that it did not. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to those slaves that were still under Confederate control. So, in other words, you had to be living in a if you were an enslaved person, you had to be living in a state that where that was still in rebellion in order for you to be emancipated. But of course, it would be impossible for you to be emancipated because you were living in a state that was still under Confederate control. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the Confederate states under Union control, and did not apply to the border slave states. Slavery there remained untouched. So the Emancipation Proclamation technically did not free a single person, but it did suggest that the war had become a war about slavery, although not a war to end slavery, because the border states were going to be allowed to keep their legal slavery. Just as importantly, the Emancipation Proclamation did recommend that African Americans be allowed to serve in the Union Army for the first time. So why did Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, for one thing, by saying that this was more a war about slavery than it was before, the British would refuse to aid the Confederacy. The British were anti-slavery, and so they wouldn't aid the Confederacy if this was more about slavery than it was about the Union. Abolitionist Republicans in the North continued to pressure Lincoln, and he wanted to win the next presidential election. So that was another reason why historians say Lincoln had to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln also was listening to military advisors who said that freeing slaves would hurt the Confederate effort. It would make it impossible for the Confederacy to continue to fight when they had to worry about liberated slaves back in the homeland. And then finally, the fact that tens of thousands of African Americans had already pretty much liberated themselves meant that the institution of slavery was pretty much decimated by the war already, and this was Lincoln coming to terms with that as well. So what's the significance of the document? If it didn't free a single slave, then why does it matter? Well, the document does clearly establish that the war was being fought not just to preserve the Union, but also to eliminate slavery. Is that what Lincoln wanted to convey? Probably not. But is that the message that people heard? Yeah. The war also, I mean, the document also established the right of African Americans to fight in the war. Um, and fight they did. Here are images of African Americans fighting alongside as Union soldiers and sailors and workers for the Union Army. And the many thousands of African Americans who joined the Union were certainly instrumental in helping the Union win the war. So, I'll skip that. Come back to that. Anyway, that's it. Thank you and goodbye.